this is Peter with AM and PM Tutoring. Today I'm going to walk you through all of the punctuation rules you'll need to know to ace the ACT English section. Check out my other videos to learn more about the other English rules you'll need to ace this section. There's about 35 of them. This will just cover punctuation today. Let's jump right into it. Our first thing we need to learn about is commas. Commas are used to separate words or groups of words in a simple series of 3 or more items, meaning a list. For example, the sentence, gerbils eat bread, comma, carrots, and broccoli. Now some of you might be saying, now wait a second, do we need a comma after carrots? And the answer is, it's optional. That's a special kind of comma called the Oxford comma. And there's been a great debate, specifically in Oxford, England, about whether or not this comma is necessary. On the ACT, they'll never ask you to choose one way being right or the other, because either one is acceptable. Commas can also be used to separate 2 adjectives when the adjectives are interchangeable. For example, the sentence, it was a frightening, comma, hideous painting. Or, she was a bright, comma, pretty young girl. You notice how these adjectives have different meanings, but you could put them in either order to describe the same person. You can also use commas to tie together a dependent clause and an independent clause. Time out. Let's talk through what that means. A dependent clause is a clause that depends on the rest of the sentence, meaning it isn't a sentence on its own. An independent clause stands strong and independent. It is a sentence on its own. So let's look at an example. While Jenny slept, I ate all her cookies. Now you notice we put a comma after while Jenny slept. Now if I read that as a sentence, while Jenny slept, is that a full sentence? No, it's not. So it's a dependent clause. I ate all her cookies. Is that a full sentence? Yes, it is. So that's an independent clause. So commas can tie together a dependent and an independent clause. Are they strong enough to hold together an independent clause to another independent clause? No, they're not. So you need something stronger, like a period in between the 2 sentences, or a semicolon, or a comma and. A comma and is strong enough glue to hold 2 independent clauses together. For example, Jenny was asleep, comma, and I ate all her cookies, period. There you notice Jenny was asleep is a sentence, and I ate all her cookies is a sentence. So we needed a comma and, not just a comma. You can also use commas to set off non-essential parts of the sentence within the sentence. I call these parentheses commas. For example, the man, realizing there was no escape, turned to face the approaching lion. You notice here that this is basically a dependent clause inserted into the middle of this sentence. The trick with these on the ACT is to read the sentence without what's severed in between the parentheses commas and see if it's a real sentence. The man turned to face the approaching lion. That's an okay sentence. Therefore, I know that it's okay that we have these parentheses commas there. Let's move on to apostrophes. Apostrophes are used to show possession or ownership. Now, if there's only one person owning the thing, then it's pretty straightforward. You do apostrophe S. For example, Bill's kid, Janet's bike, the rock's tip. If we want to show possession where more than one person is owning something, then we put the apostrophe after the S because the word ends in S. For example, the kid's faces, the fish's tails, because there's more than one kid and more than one fish. Now there are some plural words that don't end in S. For example, the word men is more than one person, but it doesn't end in S. When that's the case, you do a regular apostrophe S, even though it's plural. So that's why we would say the kids' apostrophe faces, but the children's books with the apostrophe before the S. The only other time that this ownership is a little bit complicated is when you have a name that ends in S. For example, let's say my buddy James owns some books. Well, we could write that as either James apostrophe book or James apostrophe S book. His name is James. So we couldn't say Jame apostrophe S's book. That would be incorrect because his name is not Jame, it's James. Finally, apostrophes can be used as contractions or leaving out letters. For example, there's a snake in my boot. You'd like him. Who is that? These are short for longer things, such as there is a snake in my boot. You would like him. Who is that? The last thing to note about apostrophes is that there are two different kinds of its. Either one feels like it might need an apostrophe, but only it is needs the apostrophe. For example, the sentence, "It's important that a dog eats its food." The way that I like to remember this is I think to myself, I know one of them needs an apostrophe, but which one is it? Oh, it is. That's the one that needs the apostrophe. Hopefully that helps. All right, let's move on to colons. Before a colon, you need an independent clause. After a colon, you can put pretty much anything. And a colon needs to have the feeling of leading up to and then spitting out whatever it's talking about. Let's look at some examples. The whale wanted only one thing, to be with its mother. Well, now let's look at what parts of speech those are. The whale wanted only one thing. Is that a sentence? Yes, it is. To be with its mother. Is that a sentence? No, it's not. So we have an independent clause, colon, dependent clause. How about this example? The game was over. The Blue Sox had lost. Well, there you notice we have two full sentences. And that's okay, as long as the first one is a full sentence before the colon. Finally, the example, behind the curtain sat the only person Voldemort feared, Dumbledore. Now, I have a funny story about this example. I shared it with a student one time, and they wouldn't read the word Voldemort. They said, he who must not be named. It made me laugh. But anyway, you'll notice that this sentence coming before the colon is a full independent clause. And afterwards we have just a name. Following a colon, you can also have a list. You can have just about anything as long as you're leading up to it and spitting it out. All right, let's move on to semicolons. Before a semicolon comes an independent clause. And after a semicolon comes another independent clause. Basically, a semicolon is working just like a period does to separate two sentences, except that a semicolon links the ideas of the two sentences together. Here's an example. I'm not sure what time it is. Let's check the clock. So anywhere that you can put a semicolon, you can try to put in a period, and it should work just fine. There's one other special use of semicolons that you'll need to know for the ACT, and that is to separate lists within lists. Let me give you an example of that. Apples are shipped from Atlanta, Georgia, Miami, Florida, and Los Angeles, California. You'll notice here that we used semicolons to separate Atlanta, Georgia from Miami, Florida, and Los Angeles, California. If we had used commas, everything would have muddled together. You would have thought we were listing Atlanta and Georgia and Miami and Florida, when those aren't equals. Those are cities within states. So that's why semicolons are here. They're almost like super pumped up commas in this instance. Those are really the two uses of semicolons. Keeping apart full sentences, or very rarely separating lists within lists. Let's talk about dashes for a second. Dashes can be used in the same way that parentheses commas are, to offset things within the sentence. For example, upon discovering that he had food in his teeth, and had during the entire presentation, the CEO turned bright red and fired his assistants for not mentioning it to him. Hopefully you can feel there that we kind of mentioned that important part on the side there, and had during the entire presentation. And the same rule applies here as applied to the parentheses commas. We can ignore what's between those dashes and the sentence should still work. So that would sound like this. Upon discovering that he had food in his teeth, the CEO turned bright red and fired his assistants for not mentioning it to him. Yeah, that works. Now, somebody asked me one time, so what's the difference between parentheses, commas, and dashes? Really, they're very similar, and any would be acceptable in a certain case. Parentheses put less emphasis on whatever they're around. Commas are about equal emphasis as the rest of the sentence, and dashes put more emphasis on whatever's in the middle. But I've never seen them ask a question on the ACT that would make you choose between the two. I've only seen the kind of question that would ask, which of the following is not acceptable? Dashes, commas, parentheses, or two semicolons. And of course, the semicolons can't do that the same way that the other ones can. Dashes can also be used in just a single dash at the end of a sentence, almost like a colon. For example, there was a large fish staring at the only person on the bank. Dash, Jeremy. Finally, we have periods, question marks, and exclamation points. Very straightforward. Periods, end a sentence. Question marks, end a question. Exclamation points add added emotion or emphasis. I hope this was helpful, and thanks for watching.